I pulled into the gravel driveway and killed the engine, looking at the cabin through my windshield. 3 months of restless nights and concerned friends had brought me here to Tom's property, tucked away in nowhere, northern Ontario. The place looked smaller than I'd pictured from his stories, but something about its sturdy, welcoming feel made my chest ease for the first time in weeks. Tom's truck was absent. He'd said he might have to run back to town before I got there. Something about picking up supplies. I grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat and climbed the wooden steps to the front porch. The door was unlocked, just like he'd promised. Inside, it smelled of pine, aged wood, and traces of the coffee Tom must have made that morning. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall in the living room, and mismatched furniture gave the place a cozy, lived-in feel. Everything was clean but not overly tidy. Exactly what I needed after months of people walking on eggshells around me in my too-quiet house. I set my bag by the couch and noticed a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table, my name written across it in Tom's handwriting. The note was longer than I expected, both sides filled with his careful script. Diana, hope the drive was good. Coffee's above the sink, food in the fridge. Make yourself at home. I need you to follow these rules while you're here. They'll sound strange, but trust me on this. The cabin has quirks. These will keep you safe. 1. Keep the back door unlocked at all times. 2. Never open the front door to any man between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. 3. If you hear footsteps on the roof, lock the front door right away. 4. Don't leave the cabin after dark. 5. Keep the radio on 99.1. It has to stay on that frequency. 6. If the radio stops playing, go to the bathroom and lock yourself in until it starts again. I'll be back in a few days. Cell service is spotty, but there's a landline for emergencies. Tom. I read through the list twice, my eyebrows rising with each line. Tom had always been practical to a fault, the type with emergency kits in every vehicle and first aid knowledge. This was completely unlike him. The backdoor rule made no sense. Who leaves doors unlocked in the middle of the woods? And not opening the front door to men? What was I supposed to do, demand ID through the window? The radio thing seemed just as odd. I walked to the small stereo on the kitchen counter and saw it was already set to 99.1, playing some classic rock station with more static than music. I folded the note and tucked it in my pocket. Tom had probably picked up these habits from locals, the kind who believed in backward superstitions. Or maybe he thought a city woman needed extra precautions out here. Either way, most of the rules seemed designed to keep me nervous and jumpy, the opposite of why I'd come. I spent the afternoon unpacking and learning the cabin's layout. The bathroom was small but worked, with a high window fitted with metal bars, just like every other window. Even the bedroom window had them. Tom had said they were for break-in protection, though they felt like overkill for such a remote spot. The bars bothered me more than I wanted to admit. They made the cozy cabin feel less like a retreat and more like a place where someone had once needed to keep something out, or in. I pushed that thought aside and focused on putting my clothes in the bedroom dresser. Dinner was simple, canned soup and bread from Tom's surprisingly well-stocked kitchen. I ate at the small table while the radio played in the background, mostly static-filled country music that faded in and out with the weather. The sun was setting behind the trees. I was washing dishes when the first sound came from overhead. Thump. I froze, hands in the soapy water. Could have been a branch falling, or a bird landing hard. The sound came again, more deliberate this time. Thump. Thump. Then a slow, measured series of impacts moving from one end of the roof to the other. Footsteps. My mind went straight to Tom's third rule, lock the front door if you hear footsteps on the roof. I dried my hands and walked to the living room, looking up at the ceiling. The sounds continued, definitely like someone walking across the roof with slow, careful steps. Raccoons, probably. Or a black bear. Tom had said they were common. Large animals climb on roofs all the time, looking for food or easy access to garbage. The rhythm could easily be an animal's natural gait. I stayed in the living room, listening as the sounds moved back and forth above me. Whatever was up there seemed to be taking its time, exploring the whole roof. The steps would pause for long moments, then resume somewhere else. It went on for nearly an hour. The radio crackled with static, and I turned it up a little to cover the noise. I wasn't about to lock myself in because of some animal on the roof. Tom's rules might work for him, but I'd lived in the city long enough to know most scary sounds have reasonable explanations. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I waited another 10 minutes, but the roof stayed quiet. I checked the front door, still unlocked, just as I'd left it. Nothing had tried to get in. No mysterious figures at the windows. The metal bars were undisturbed. I made tea and settled into the living room chair with a paperback. The radio kept up its mix of music and static, and the cabin felt peaceful again. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself listening for sounds from the roof, but the night remained quiet. Sleep didn't come easily. Every normal forest noise, wind in the branches, old wood settling, distant animal calls, made me tense. I kept thinking about Tom's rules and what had made him so cautious. The bed was comfortable, but I found myself staring at the ceiling, half expecting those measured footsteps to return. By morning, nothing had happened. No strange visitors, no odd occurrences, no proof of Tom's paranoid rules. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the peaceful clearing. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds called in the distance. Everything looked completely normal. I pulled Tom's note from my pocket and read the rules again. They seemed even more ridiculous in daylight. Whatever had been on the roof last night was long gone, probably back to its den somewhere in the forest. I'd spent my first night jumping at shadows and forest sounds, just like any city person would. Tom meant well, but his rules were designed to make me afraid of my own shadow. I'd come here for peace, not to live in fear of imaginary threats. The cabin was exactly what I needed, isolated, quiet, far from the well-meaning friends who kept asking how I was doing. I wasn't going to let superstitions ruin that. I left the note on the kitchen counter. I'd follow reasonable precautions, keeping doors locked at night, not wandering around in the dark. But I wasn't going to let Tom's quirky rule system dictate my stay. The footsteps on the roof had been wildlife, nothing more. The sooner I accepted that, the sooner I could actually relax. I pulled the last of my sweaters from the duffel and arranged them in the bedroom dresser, trying to bring some order to the small space. My second morning at the cabin started with strong coffee and the satisfaction of a full night's sleep. No mysterious footsteps disturbing my rest. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. Tom had mentioned walking trails, and I needed to stretch my legs after the long drive up. I grabbed a water bottle and stepped out the back door, noting again how Tom insisted it stay unlocked. The forest pressed close on three sides, but the cabin sat in a perfect circular clearing that felt almost too neat. Walking the edge, I started noticing details that seemed oddly intentional. The clearing wasn't natural. Someone had deliberately removed trees to create this exact space. The tree line formed an almost perfect circle around the cabin, staying the same distance from the building in every direction. Even the cabin's placement felt calculated, dead center in the cleared area with mathematical precision. I followed what looked like an old path going east from the clearing. The trail was well maintained, cleared of fallen branches and obstacles. After about 50 yards, it simply stopped. Not at a scenic overlook or natural boundary, just ended where the forest grew thicker. I backtracked and tried the north path. Same result, a clear trail that stopped without apparent reason. Every path I found showed the same pattern, well-maintained walkways that went exactly the same distance from the cabin before stopping dead. Someone had created a network of trails that went nowhere, as if the goal was simply to provide safe walking space within a specific radius. Back at the cabin, I made lunch and tried to shake off the growing sense that everything about this place had been designed according to some plan I didn't understand. The careful clearing, the measured trails, even the cabin's placement, it all felt too deliberate to be coincidence. I settled into the living room chair with my book, determined to enjoy the peaceful afternoon. The radio played its usual mix of classic rock and static, and the sun streamed through the barred windows in pleasant patterns across the floor. The exhaustion from yesterday's poor sleep caught up with me gradually, my eyelids growing heavy as I read the same paragraph 3 times. The book slipped from my hands as I dozed off. I woke to absolute silence. The change jolted me alert immediately. The radio had been playing when I fell asleep, providing constant background music and static. Now the cabin felt hollow, empty of any sound except my own breathing. I sat up and looked at the radio on the kitchen counter. The power light was still on, glowing red to show it was plugged in and working. I walked over and checked the dial, still tuned to 99.1, exactly where Tom had left it. I turned the volume up and down, but heard nothing except the faint electronic buzz of the speakers. Tom's 6th rule came back to me: if the radio stops playing, go to the bathroom and lock yourself in until it starts again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the silent radio. This was ridiculous. Radios break all the time, especially in remote areas with poor reception. The station could be having technical difficulties, or atmospheric conditions could be interfering with the signal. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for why it might have stopped broadcasting. But the silence felt wrong somehow, too complete and deliberate. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. Nothing particularly significant about the time, but something made my skin prickle as I stood in the quiet kitchen. I looked toward the small bathroom near the bedroom, feeling absurd for even considering Tom's instruction. Locking myself in a tiny room because a radio broke was exactly the kind of paranoid behavior I'd come here to escape. I was a grown woman, not a frightened child who needed to hide from technical difficulties. The silence stretched on, heavy and expectant. I caught myself holding my breath, listening for something I couldn't name. The normal forest sounds that had been a constant backdrop since my arrival seemed muted, as if the world outside had also gone quiet. I walked to the bathroom and stood in the doorway, my hand on the frame. This was insane. I was actually considering hiding in a bathroom because a radio had stopped working. Tom's weird beliefs were turning me into someone I didn't recognize. But the quiet felt increasingly unnatural, pressing against my ears like water. I stepped inside and closed the door, then immediately felt stupid for doing it. I reached for the handle to leave, then stopped. What harm could it do to wait a few minutes? If the radio started working again, I could dismiss the whole thing as coincidence. If it didn't, at least I'd know the problem wasn't from following Tom's bizarre instructions. I turned the lock with a soft click and sat on the edge of the bathtub. The bathroom was tiny, barely large enough for the necessary fixtures, but it felt secure in a way I couldn't explain. The small window high on the wall had the same metal bars as the others, casting thin shadows across the tile floor. Minutes passed with no change. I checked my watch repeatedly: 3:52, 3:55, 3:58. The silence beyond the door remained absolute. I pressed my ear to the wood but heard nothing from the main cabin, no radio static, no electrical buzzes, no settling of old wood. Just nothing. At 4:08, the radio suddenly blared back to life. Music filled the cabin again, the same classic rock station playing as if nothing had happened. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out. The radio played normally, no static or signal problems, as if the past 20 minutes of silence had never occurred. I walked to the kitchen and stared at the radio, searching for any explanation. The power cord was securely plugged in. No timers or automatic controls were visible on the simple unit. I checked the electrical panel near the back door, no trip breakers, no signs of power interruption. Every other electrical device in the cabin had continued working normally. The silence had lasted exactly 21 minutes, then ended as suddenly as it had begun. I made tea with shaking hands, trying to process what had just happened. Technical problems didn't work that way. Radios didn't stop and start without cause, especially not in such precise time frames. And the complete silence had extended beyond just the radio. Even the background noise of the forest had seemed muted during those 21 minutes. I found Tom's note on the counter where I'd left it and read through his rules again. They didn't seem quite as ridiculous now. The radio instruction had worked, whatever that meant. I'd followed his guidance and come out unharmed when the silence ended. Sitting at the kitchen table, I watched the sun sink lower through the barred windows. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation for the radio incident: equipment failure, atmospheric interference, power fluctuations, any number of mundane causes. But the deliberate quality of the silence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. It hadn't felt random or accidental. The timing, the completeness, the sudden return to normal, everything about it had seemed purposeful. I started preparing dinner as darkness gathered outside, glancing frequently at the radio to make sure it kept playing. The sounds of sizzling vegetables and boiling water felt reassuring. After the afternoon's unsettling quiet, I kept the kitchen lights on and found myself moving more carefully through the cabin, paying attention to shadows and corners in ways I hadn't before. Tom's other rules didn't seem quite so paranoid anymore. The back door remained unlocked, just as he'd instructed. I checked the front door twice to make sure it was properly secured. The radio continued its steady broadcast, and I turned the volume up slightly to ensure I'd notice if it stopped again. As I ate dinner, I found myself actually considering the possibility that Tom knew something I didn't about this place: the careful clearing around the cabin, the precisely maintained trails, the metal bars on every window. Maybe it all served some purpose I hadn't understood. Maybe his rules weren't weird beliefs but practical knowledge gained through experience. The radio played steadily through dinner, a comforting constant that I watched more closely than any broadcast deserved. Whatever had caused the afternoon silence, I wasn't eager to experience it again. Tom's instructions had worked, even if I couldn't explain why. Sometimes practical results mattered more than understanding the reasons behind them. Darkness settled fully outside the barred windows. As I finished cleaning up, the forest beyond the clearing disappeared into shadow, and the cabin felt smaller, more isolated. I kept the radio volume at a level where I could hear it clearly from any room, unwilling to risk missing another sudden silence. I closed Tom's grandfather's journal and set it on the coffee table, rubbing my eyes. The handwritten entries dated back to 1962, filled with careful observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and what the old man had called unusual occurrences. Reading his precise documentation of strange events felt surreal after my own experience with the radio silence that afternoon. The clock on the kitchen wall read 10:31 p.m. I'd been reading for hours, losing track of time as I absorbed 3 generations of meticulous record-keeping. Tom's grandfather had approached the unexplained with scientific curiosity rather than fear, treating each incident as data to be analyzed and understood. His methodical nature reminded me of Tom himself. I stretched and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. The radio continued its steady broadcast, playing an old rock ballad I'd heard countless times before. After this afternoon's silence, the constant music felt like a lifeline. I wasn't willing to let go. The cabin felt secure around me, warm and well lit against the darkness outside. I'd kept every lamp on since sunset, unwilling to sit in shadows after the day's unsettling events. The barred windows reflected my movements back at me like dark mirrors, showing nothing of the forest beyond. I was refilling my water glass when the knocking started. Sharp, urgent raps against the front door made me freeze with the faucet still running. The sound was distinctly human, knuckles against wood, not the random bumping of an animal. Someone was out there at 10:47 p.m., according to the kitchen clock. "Hello," a man's voice called through the door. "Please, I need help." I turned off the faucet and moved toward the living room, staying several feet back from the door. Tom's second rule echoed in my mind: never open the front door to any man between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. My car broke down about 3 miles back. The voice continued, muffled but clear through the wood. "I've been walking for hours. I'm freezing out here." I stepped closer to the front window and looked through the gap in the curtains. A middle-aged man stood on the porch, visible in the light from the cabin windows. His clothes looked torn and dirty, and he was rubbing his arms as if trying to warm himself. Everything about his appearance supported his story. He looked genuinely upset and cold. "Please," he called again, louder. "I just need to use your phone. My cell doesn't have service out here." I felt bad for him. The night had turned cold, and 3 miles was a long walk in the dark through unfamiliar forest. Any decent person would help someone in genuine distress. But Tom's rule was specific and absolute: no men after 10 p.m. "I'm sorry," I called through the door, my voice carrying more uncertainty than I wanted. "I can't open the door right now, but I can call for help if you give me your location." "What?" The man's voice rose in disbelief. "You can see I'm hurt and freezing, and you won't even open your door." I could hear the genuine shock and hurt in his tone. Standing there in my warm, well-lit cabin while someone suffered outside made me feel cruel and heartless. Every instinct told me to unlock the door and let him inside where it was safe. "Look, I know this is strange," I said, pressing closer to the door. "But I can call emergency services for you. They'll send someone to help." "Are you serious right now?" His voice turned sharp with anger. "I'm lost. I'm cold. I'm asking for basic human decency. What kind of person turns away someone who needs help?" The accusation hit hard because it was true. I was being exactly the kind of selfish person I'd always criticized, someone who put their own comfort over another's real need. The man outside was suffering while I stood in warmth and safety, refusing to help because of a weird rule I didn't even understand. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. Tom had been firm about this rule above all others. His note had been clear and absolute. But looking at the situation logically, what harm could come from helping someone who was obviously in trouble? "I'm calling for help right now," I said, pulling my hand back from the lock. "Emergency services will be here soon." "You heartless," he snarled, his voice completely different now. "I'm dying out here, and you won't even." The man's voice changed mid-sentence, dropping to a register that made my skin crawl. The tone became deeper, rougher, like it was being filtered through something that wasn't quite human. The change was so sudden and unnatural that I stepped back from the door without thinking. Then he began pounding. Not knocking, pounding. Heavy, violent impacts that shook the entire doorframe and made the walls vibrate. The sound was too loud, too forceful for human fists. It was like something with enormous strength was trying to break through the wood with deliberate, measured blows. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the landline phone, my hand shaking as I dialed Tom's number. The pounding continued, rhythmic and relentless, broken up by that unnaturally deep voice hurling obscenities and threats that became increasingly incoherent. "Deanna." Tom's voice came through immediately, no sleepiness or confusion despite the late hour. "Are you all right?" "There's someone at the door," I said, barely above a whisper. He says his car broke down, but his voice, Tom, there's something wrong with his voice. Listen to me very carefully, Tom said, his tone urgent and focused. Stay away from the door. Don't open it. Don't respond to anything it says. That thing outside isn't human. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a low growling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The voice that had been pleading for help minutes earlier now produced sounds no human throat could make, deep rumbling noises that felt like they were coming from something much larger than the man I'd seen on the porch. It will leave eventually, Tom continued, his voice steady and reassuring despite the chaos outside. The important thing is that you don't invite it in. Don't open any doors or windows. It can't enter without permission. How long? I whispered, clutching the phone as the growling grew louder. Hours sometimes. But it will give up. Just stay inside and wait it out. The phone line went dead, leaving me alone with the sounds outside. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall as far from the front door as possible, listening to the creature circle the cabin. Heavy footsteps moved around the outside, along with scraping sounds as it tested the barred windows. I turned off every light in the cabin, putting myself in darkness. If I couldn't see it, maybe it would lose interest faster. The sounds continued, scratching at windows, rattling the back door handle, returning to pound on the front door with more violence. The voice kept changing throughout the night, sometimes returning to the sad human tone that had first drawn my sympathy, other times dropping into inhuman growls and roars that seemed designed to terrify rather than communicate. It pleaded, threatened, swore, and raged in an endless cycle that went on for hours. I sat in the dark living room, watching the barred windows for any sign of movement while the radio continued its steady broadcast. The music felt like my only connection to the normal world while something impossible walked around the cabin outside. Every few minutes, the creature would test a different window or door, carefully checking every possible entry point. Near dawn, the sounds finally stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. I waited in the dark for nearly an hour, afraid the quiet was another trick, before finally accepting that whatever had been outside was truly gone. But sleep was impossible. I sat against the bathroom door, the small room feeling like the safest space in the cabin, and waited for sunrise to confirm I'd survived the night. I heard Tom's truck rumble into the clearing just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The sound made me jump, even though I'd been expecting him since our brief phone call hours earlier. I'd spent the remaining darkness in the kitchen, nursing my third cup of coffee and staring at the back door that had somehow stayed untested throughout the night's attack. The truck door slammed, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. Tom didn't knock. He called out my name and waited for me to unlock the front door. When I pulled it open, his face immediately showed the concern I'd heard in his voice during our midnight conversation. "Jesus, Diana, you look like hell." I probably did. My hand shook as I stepped back to let him inside, and I knew the exhaustion showed in every line of my face. I didn't sleep much. Tom closed the door behind him and turned the lock carefully. "I'm sorry. I should have been here. You should have told me the truth." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften them. "Whatever that thing was last night, you knew it might come." Tom nodded and followed me to the kitchen. I poured him coffee without asking, needing something to do with my hands. He accepted the mug and sat across from me at the small table, his weathered face serious in the morning light coming through the barred windows. "My family has owned this land for 4 generations," he began, wrapping his hands around the coffee mug. "My great-grandfather bought it in 1923, back when nobody wanted remote forest property this far north. He thought he'd gotten a bargain." I waited for him to continue, too tired for polite encouragement. Took him about 6 months to realize why the previous owner had been so eager to sell. Tom's voice carried the weight of old family stories, passed down through decades of careful telling. There was something already living here. Something territorial. The memory of last night's pounding and inhuman growls made me shiver. What is it? We've never known exactly. Grandfather called it the Forest Keeper in his journals. It's intelligent, follows patterns, has its own rules about the land. Most importantly, it can't enter human dwellings without invitation, and it respects certain boundaries. Tom pointed toward the window bars, and suddenly their presence made terrible sense. Those aren't to keep burglars out. They're part of an agreement that goes back almost a century. The entity recognizes them as barriers it won't cross. Same with the clearing around the cabin. It won't approach closer than the tree line during daylight hours. And the radio? I asked. Early warning system. When it goes silent, the entity is actively testing boundaries, checking for changes or violations of the established rules. My grandfather figured that out in the 1960s after keeping detailed logs for decades. I thought about yesterday afternoon's 21 minutes of absolute silence. How I'd instinctively followed Tom's instruction to lock myself in the bathroom. It was testing yesterday. Probably sensing a new presence. The entity doesn't like changes to the routine. Tom studied my face carefully. That's why I hoped you might be ignored. Short-term visitors sometimes don't register as significant. The casual way he said it ignited my anger all over again. You hoped? You let me come here knowing that thing might show up, and you hoped it would ignore me. I thought. Tom stopped and shook his head. No, that's not fair to you. I was selfish. I wanted to help you get away from everything back home. And I convinced myself the risk was minimal. Minimal. I set down my coffee mug harder than necessary. Tom, that thing spent hours trying to get inside. It pounded on the door so hard the wall shook. And the sounds it made, I couldn't finish describing the inhuman growls and roars that had punctuated the night. I know. I've heard them myself, more times than I care to count. Tom's voice carried genuine regret. My grandfather documented every encounter he could. My father added his own observations. I've been keeping the family record since Dad passed 10 years ago. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, its leather cover worn smooth from handling. 3 generations of encounters. And the entity has never harmed anyone who followed the rules properly. It tests boundaries. It makes noise. It tries to scare people. But it can't actually hurt someone who stays inside and doesn't invite it in. I looked at the notebook, recognizing it as similar to the journal I'd been reading yesterday. How often does this happen? Depends on the season and circumstances. More frequent during new moon periods, almost never during the day. Sometimes months pass with no activity at all. Tom opened the notebook and flipped through pages of careful handwriting. The pattern is consistent enough that we've learned to predict most encounters. We? My family. Anyone who's lived on this property long term. The entity becomes part of your routine after a while, like knowing when to expect winter storms or when the spring floods will come. The matter-of-fact way he described coexisting with something supernatural made my head spin. Tom, this is insane. Normal people don't live with monsters in their backyard. Normal people don't own land where something like this has established territory. Tom closed the notebook and met my eyes directly. Look, I can drive you back to the city today. Right now, if you want. I'll pack your things and we can be gone within the hour. The offer should have been exactly what I wanted to hear. I'd come here looking for peace and quiet, not supernatural encounters that kept me awake all night in terror. Any reasonable person would pack immediately and never look back. But something made me pause. Tell me more about the rules. Tom raised an eyebrow. Diana, you don't have to. The rules, I repeated. How does this arrangement actually work? Tom looked at my face for a long moment, then opened his notebook again. The entity respects specific boundaries and limitations. It won't cross the tree line during daylight hours. It can't enter buildings without invitation. It won't damage property that's been marked according to traditional agreements. What kind of agreements? Gestures of respect, mostly. The unlocked back door acknowledges that this is shared land, not exclusively human territory. The radio provides a communication channel. When it's working, we're following our part of the arrangement. When it goes silent, we know to take extra precautions. I thought about the careful clearing around the cabin, the precisely maintained trails that led nowhere. Everything here was designed around this thing's behavior. For generations of observation and adaptation. My great-grandfather started with trial and error. Grandfather refined the system through systematic documentation. Dad added improvements based on decades of experience. I've maintained what works and made minor adjustments. Tom leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully. It's not random or chaotic, Diana. The entity follows predictable patterns. Once you understand the rules, encounters become manageable rather than scary. Rules. Predictable patterns. Manageable encounters. After months of grief counselors who insisted I needed to accept that life was unpredictable and beyond my control, Tom was describing a situation where very old agreements provided structure and safety. How long have you lived with this arrangement? I grew up here. Left for college and work, but came back 15 years ago when Dad needed help maintaining the property. Tom's voice carried the familiarity of someone discussing a longtime neighbor. The entity knows me, recognizes my presence as legitimate. New people require a longer adjustment period. Adjustment period. More frequent testing. Closer attention to rule compliance. Occasional boundary challenges like last night. Tom closed his notebook and slipped it back into his jacket. But even that follows patterns. The entity learns new routines and settles back into established behaviors. I sat quietly for several minutes, processing everything he'd told me. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all impossible, that I should pack immediately and return to the real world where monsters didn't exist. But the exhausted, grief-stricken part recognized something appealing in Tom's description: rules that could be learned and followed, patterns that could be predicted and managed, a system where respectful behavior led to peaceful coexistence even with something dangerous. These journals your family kept, I said finally. Could I read them? Tom's surprise was obvious. Diana, you really don't need to put yourself through this. I can have you back in the city by noon. That's not what I asked. He looked at my face again, searching for something I wasn't sure I understood myself. Grandfather's journals are here in the cabin. Dad's records are in my truck. Mine are split between here and my place in town. I want to read them all. Why? I didn't have a good answer. At least not one that made logical sense. The creature from last night had been terrifying, and any normal person would run away after such an encounter. But something about Tom's matter-of-fact description of rules and agreements appealed to me in ways I couldn't fully explain. Because I need to understand how this works. Tom nodded slowly. All right. But I'm staying for a few days while you read through everything. If you decide this isn't for you, I'll drive you back personally and we'll never mention it again. And if I decide it is for me, then I'll teach you everything I know about living safely with something that was here long before any of us.